Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're diving back into some American Civil War history, specifically a video that just came out from our friends at Kings and Generals about the Battle of Fredericksburg, which you may or may not be aware. I try to point it out whenever possible. In the history of North and South America, saw the largest collection of troops on one battlefield at any point in history. More than Gettysburg, more than any other battle that was fought during the American Civil War or any other time. There were nearly 200,000 soldiers on the field for the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. So it'll be interesting to see their take on it, and of course I'll offer my commentary wherever possible. Just a little bit of nostalgia. The very first trip I ever took to a historic site to make content specifically for vlogging through history was in February of 2021 when I visited the Fredericksburg battlefield. It was my very first time visiting Fredericksburg. So I'll put a link down in the description as well as up on the screen at the end to that content so you can check it out. I've come a long way, I like to think, since then, so don't expect high quality of production value. It's early VTH stuff, but the information's still really good. Of course, check out my channel, Stories of the Civil War, for all of my original content related to that war. Link is in the description to the original video from Kings and Generals, and I want to thank Rob well, it doesn't say what town he's in California, but Rob, you know who you are. You signed up a couple of weeks ago as a patron. It says California, California on the address. So thank you, Rob, for signing up as a patron. I really appreciate it. Let's dive into this one.
Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland failed brutally. The Battle of Antietam left his army crippled, and had George Mclellan put any effort into pursuing him, it could have been destroyed.
100% true. Robert E. Lee goes into the Battle of Antietam with slightly under 40,000 men. McClellan's got twice that and then some. And Lee loses a good chunk of what little army he had. And if McClellan had thrown any effort whatsoever into the battle, which McClellan was not something he did, he could have absolutely destroyed Lee. Lee marched into Maryland thinking that the people of Maryland were going to rise up and support him, and there would just be this kind of popular uprising. But the problem is the parts of Maryland that supported the Confederacy were not the parts that he was marching into.
Fortunately for the South, McClellan was too busy celebrating his own army escaping destruction at the hands of Lee's imagined overwhelming numbers. As he limped back into Virginia, Lee prepared to rebuild his army and go into winter quarters, unaware that Abraham Lincoln didn't intend to allow him any reprieve. Welcome to our latest video on the American Civil War, in which the conflict rages on, and Robert E. Lee clashes against his Union foes at the dramatic but strategically ambiguous battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. As war raged on the American continent, the continent of Europe looked on. Britain and France hoped to use the war to their strategic advantage. Both nations needed Southern cotton too much to cut ties with the South post-secession. The Confederacy knew this and was actively seeking their recognition.
And the Confederacy relied on this pretty heavily, but it didn't work out for them because they either went without or they found alternative sources for getting that cotton. There was something in the UK called the Cotton Famine. I don't know, it might have been going on in France too. I'm just not as familiar with French history, which did hurt textile mills, especially in the northern cities of England. And it did lead in part to an exodus of people who emigrated from the UK into the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. But the South was banking too much on cotton kind of wielding enough power for them to get European recognition.
However, neither Britain nor France wanted to go to war with the United States, which Lincoln threatened if they recognized the Confederacy, and officially stayed neutral. France instead used America's inability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine to attempt to conquer Mexico, ceasing to be Lincoln's problem.
Yeah, see, this is, the French and the British, their primary concern is not helping one side or the other. Their primary concern is, as it rightfully should be, their own strategic interests. And while the North and the South, while the United States is busy fighting itself, there's an open door there.
Similarly, Spain reconquered the Dominican Republic. However, Britain remained a diplomatic threat. The French wanted Britain to take the lead on recognizing the Confederacy, and London was willing to do so. Many cabinet ministers and aristocrats sympathized with and advocated for the Southern planters.
I don't know if I'd say London was willing to do so. I think it's more accurate to say that there were those in London who were willing to do so.
Prime Minister Lord Palmerston wanted to weaken the United States for power politics purposes. He hoped to play Lincoln off Jefferson Davis, as he did with European rivals, for Britain's advantage, which is why he also quietly supported France's Mexican adventure. Defanging Palmerston required making the war about slavery. British workers were now so anti-slavery that they refused to process Southern cotton on principle, and cheered when this led to a recession in the textile industry.
So, that's the cotton famine I was talking about. And so, remember, the UK has been ahead of the US on the issue of slavery. Both countries banned the slave trade around the same time, within a couple of years of each other. But slavery itself had been banned in the British Empire back in the early 1830s, and so several decades before this. And by this point, public sentiment has turned pretty heavily against it. And so that was an impossible hurdle to overcome for the British government in any potential recognition of the Confederate government.
So long as the war was just to preserve the Union, Palmerston could continuously float support for the South for diplomatic leverage without suffering internal backlash. However, if the war was about ending slavery, Palmerston would face riots for even suggesting helping slaveholders, and he knew it.
And this is a big part of the unspoken reason why Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes, Lincoln was anti-slavery, but he was also somebody who was pragmatic, who didn't believe he necessarily had the political capital or ability to end slavery in the United States until the war gave him an open door for that. And so he uses it initially as a war measure because that's all he feels he can do until they can pass a constitutional amendment. But it also helps with the diplomatic issues at stake.
Furthermore, hundreds of slaves were fleeing to federal lines, forcing individual commanders to decide their fate. Most followed Benjamin Butler's Fort Monroe Doctrine, which declared that since Southerners were rebels and claimed to be a foreign country, the Fugitive Slave Act was void. Instead, escaped slaves were classified as contrabands of war and enrolled as military laborers, frequently with pay.
And this is one of the conundrums that Lincoln faces, is he doesn't want to recognize the Confederacy as a foreign government. He believes that the laws of those states are still in force because the states are still part of the United States. It's just that people within those states have become rebels and have rebelled against the government. So he still recognizes these laws as valid, but he also does like the idea of declaring them to be contraband. And so since they're at war with the government, he can take them as property seized in wartime.
Lincoln disliked that the doctrine tacitly agreed that secession was possible, as he strenuously maintained it was impossible, but he approved of freeing the slaves morally and pragmatically. Without slaves, the Southern economy would crumble and end the war. Lincoln also wanted to formally permit emancipation via federal arms, but doing so required an Eastern Theater victory, lest it seem like a desperate ploy. Antietam wasn't the kind of victory Lincoln wanted, but it would do. On September 22nd, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves held in actively rebelling U.S. territory would be free on January 1, 1863. The South correctly read it as an ultimatum to surrender or lose its slaves, which it rejected. Palmerston also got the message, and his government stopped openly favoring the South.
There you go.
Meanwhile, Mclellan had to go. As commander-in-chief, Lincoln had the authority to replace him, but doing so was politically dangerous. Both the soldiers and the press loved Little Mac.
And Lincoln was very mindful of keeping the war Democrats. In other words, most of the Southerners who rebelled, they were in the Democratic Party at that time. But there were also Northern Democrats who supported the Union and supported the war effort. We call them War Democrats. And a lot of them were political generals, or they were generals with a military background who happened to be Democrats, like George McClellan, like John McClernand, like Dan Sickles. These are people that he needed to give prominent positions to keep the War Democrats happy. And so he wants to fire McClellan. In fact, he fired him once and then brought him back. He wants to fire him, but he needs to wait until after the congressional elections in November of 1862. So he would have fired him right after Antietam if he could have.
And he had acquired many political allies to support his political ambitions. Simply firing him was out of the question, despite demands from Lincoln's cabinet. McClellan made clear that he wouldn't accept a transfer away from his army, and that he wanted to be general-in-chief again. Thus, moving him to a new army or desk job was out. Lincoln had intended to fold the Army of the Potomac into the Army of Virginia to sidestep this problem, but John Pope's disaster at Second Bull Run killed the plan.
He brought Pope from the West, and Pope was just full of himself and was convinced that he was the savior of the Union, and he came over and got his butt kicked at Second Manassas, Second Bull Run. And then at that point, that was when McClellan came along and said, basically was the only guy who could pull the army back together again and save Washington from annihilation and capture.
The Union Army's pool of senior generals with experience victoriously leading independent commands was quite shallow. McClellan's tenure had made clear that the general-in-chief shouldn't also command an army, disqualifying Henry Halleck. There were several successful generals out west, but Pope's tenure had made bringing another east unpalatable. Sacrificing the successful west for the struggling east was equally unattractive.
We're just going to not show Grant in that, I guess.
The only option was Ambrose Burnside. During the Peninsula Campaign, Burnside commanded a joint Army-Navy expedition that won a number of battles and successfully captured Pamlico's Sound. Lincoln first asked him to replace McClellan in mid-July, but Burnside refused, believing himself utterly unqualified.
He was
His
right.
entire Carolina command was currently being reorganized as the Army of the Potomac's 9th Corps. Moreover, he'd just been promoted to Major General and relied heavily on more experienced naval officers during his campaign. This forced Lincoln to call Pope east. Following Pope's defeat, Lincoln again asked Burnside to take command, and again he refused. Once Antietam partially confirmed Burnside's self-evaluation, Lincoln attempted to fix McClellan.
And what does he mean by that? Well, Antietam was in charge of the southern part, the left flank of McClellan's army at Antietam, and had a bit of difficulty getting across the bridge we call today Burnside Bridge, despite it being pretty lightly defended.
Orders from Washington failed to stir him to action. Lincoln dismissed Don Carlos Buell from the Army of Ohio on October 24th for failing to pursue Braxton Bragg, to send McClellan a message.
I should point out it's the Army of the Ohio. The Union armies were named after rivers.
When the stubborn general did...
And actually, I should expand on that a little bit. The Union armies actually started out as departments, and so you had the Department of the Ohio, and therefore the army that was formed from troops that were assigned to the Department of the Ohio became the Army of the Ohio. Same thing with the Department of the Tennessee, and all of these things. But eventually they became more about the armies than just about the departments.
Didn't react. Lincoln relieved him on November 5th.
Right after the election.
Lincoln ordered Burnside to take command of the army.
Notice he didn't ask him this time. He just ordered him. And this is going to play out again later on when Lincoln offers the command of the Army of the Potomac after Chancellorsville to a couple of generals, including John Reynolds, who Reynolds says, I'll take the job if you won't interfere from Washington and you'll let me exercise authority on my own. They wouldn't do that for him, and so then they send orders for Meade to take command of the army.
Or McClellan's official dismissal. Refusing again would not save McClellan, but it would mean the next option was Joseph Hooker, whom Burnside considered more unfit than himself. Burnside reluctantly accepted and met with Halleck on November 7th, learning that he was to plan a new offensive at once. The Republicans had taken a beating in the midterms, and Union morale was low. They needed more action to restore flagging faith and recruitment numbers. This dismayed Burnside, who wanted time to settle into command and finish.
Which was a very reasonable thing to decide in that moment. It's November. Typically at this point you're kind of winding down, you're settling into winter quarters, you're going to wait until end of March, early April to even think about another campaign. And you'll see this in future years. You don't see in 1863, after October, you don't really see any major action in the Eastern Theater until the spring of It's actually May of 64 when Grant takes the army out. And then again in 65, you have some sporadic action happening around Petersburg, but the big movements of the army are going to happen late into March and in early April. So it's a reasonable thing for Burnside. The problem for Burnside is that he's coming in after what is basically a year and a half of mostly inaction by Mclellan, with a few exceptions, the Peninsula and then Antietam. But in both cases, he also was very inactive in and around those times. So Burnside comes in at an awful time when he basically has no choice but to attack.
Planning his spring offensive. However, he couldn't be given that long, so he presented the plan to Halleck on November 9th.
Keep that date in mind. He presented his plan to Halleck on November 9th, because the first problem that's going to happen with the Battle of Fredericksburg is that Burnside's plan doesn't unfold the way Burnside wants it to.
Lee's army was separated, with Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley, James Longstreet near Culpeper, and J.E.B. Stuart patrolling between the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers, so that the Army of Northern Virginia could rapidly repel any incursion down the usual invasion route with multiple flanking attacks.
And why is this the usual invasion route? Because the Union Army is a massive animal that requires feeding, and it requires supplies, and it requires regular communication back with Washington. And the easiest way to do that is through the Potomac River. And so you always keep the Potomac River as your kind of left flank, your anchor as you move south. Keeps you in supply, keeps you in contact, keeps your left flank protected. And so the natural route to move toward Richmond, which is the ultimate goal, is to go right down here.
Therefore, Burnside would flank Lee by crossing the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg via pontoon bridges, and use the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad as his supply line to swiftly capture Richmond.
You have Aquia Landing right there, so you bring your supplies down by boat, you land them at Aquia, you take that river or that railroad to supply you as you move south. That's why you have a battle here in December of 62. It's why the fighting takes place here in 63. It's why the fighting takes place here in 64.
The army would first concentrate at Warrenton to draw Lee's attention and prevent him from fortifying crossing points. Cavalry would probe towards Gordonsville and Culpeper to distract Lee before the whole army turned and forced march to Fredericksburg, using feints and demonstrations to disguise their movement.
It was a good plan. It was a good plan that would have worked effectively had everything gone the way he planned it.
Burnside would be across the river and in Lee's rear before he knew what was happening. Lincoln doubted that Lee could be deceived, but approved the otherwise sound plan on November 14th, reminding Burnside that the operation depended on speed. While awaiting for approval, Burnside reorganized his command, finding commanding 8 corps and 120,000 men too difficult. He grouped the corps into the right, center, left, and reserve grand divisions.
And this is basically about as big an army as the Union force in the East is going to have during the entire war. You'll have similar numbers happen later on when you get into 64, when Grant pulls all the troops out of the Washington defenses. But this is by far the biggest army the Unions had to this point.
These groups were commanded by Edwin Sumner, Hooker, William Franklin, and Franz Sigel, respectively. However, many officers resented Burnside replacing McClellan. He was an outsider to their army who lacked command experience, and it showed. Nevertheless, shortly after Lincoln approved the plan, Burnside was told the pontoons were ready, and he initiated the forced march on November 15th.
He was told the pontoons were ready November 15th. Keep that in mind.
Arrived at Falmouth on November 17th and found barely 500 soldiers guarding Fredericksburg.
November 17th, they arrive at Falmouth. They're basically in the vicinity at November 17th. When's the Battle of Fredericksburg happen? A month later. And there's your problem.
Consequently, he asked permission to immediately ford the Rappahannock. However, the river was rising due to heavy fall rains. Rather than let Sumner risk stranding himself and face Lee alone, Burnside ordered him to wait for the bridges, which were supposed to arrive that evening.
Exactly. And you can see why I get really, and I'm pushing this a lot, because while I'm not a huge fan of Ambrose Burnside, and I don't think he was fit to command the army, I really don't blame him for Fredericksburg. There are so many things that happened that were outside of his control. Did he make mistakes in all of this? Yes. But I lay the blame firmly at the feet of people above him and people below him for this battle. So they get there. They've got the element of surprise. They've got Lee beat to Fredericksburg. Above Fredericksburg, in other words, as you get further to the north and east on the Rappahannock River is not a navigable river. It's not a river you can take boats on. And depending on the level of the river at one time or another, you can walk across it just north of Fredericksburg. And that's initially what they were going to do, or at least try to cross with some of their troops. But the fear is you get some across, and then Lee shows up, and suddenly those guys get annihilated. And so they kind of respond in the opposite by doing nothing and sitting there. And that's a huge mistake.
In truth, the pontoon bridges were still in their assembly yard, upriver from Washington. The November 14th message actually said that the pontoons were built, but there were no horses to transport them. Burnside hadn't been told the critical last part.
Yep.
Neither the Quartermaster General nor Halleck prioritized moving the pontoons until Burnside's chief engineer inquired about them on the 17th, despite Burnside requisitioning them on November 6th, and repeatedly meeting with Halleck concerning them. The first pontoons didn't start moving until the 19th. The predicted heavy rains ground the overland march to a halt, forcing them to laboriously switch to river transport.
This is why you don't make a major action happen in November, because of the weather. This is why Burnside wanted to wait. This is why he needs the pontoon bridges, and he needs them now. None of this is his fault at this point.
Despite Lincoln's skepticism, Burnside's distractions had utterly bamboozled Lee.
Yep.
He was preparing to intercept Burnside's impending attack between Brandy Station and Sperryville when the Army of the Potomac simply disappeared. Stuart couldn't find it south or north of Warrenton, leaving headquarters frantically guessing where it was headed. Lee began spreading units across the Rappahannock and down to the James River to find Burnside. On November 19th, word arrived of the Federal appearance near Fredericksburg. Assuming that Burnside had already crossed the Rappahannock, Lee moved to prepare defenses along the North Anna River. However, Davis asked him to fight further away from Richmond to keep up civilian morale. Additionally, Longstreet arrived at Fredericksburg on November 23rd to find the Federal Army still on the northern bank. Burnside had refused more requests from his generals to ford up and down river from Fredericksburg.
And this is where you can blame Burnside. He's got subordinates under him, guys like Sumner, guys like Hancock, who are saying, we need to cross. We need to cross. The whole plan is about surprise. It's about getting on the other side of the river before Lee can dig in and present himself with a strong defensive position that's going to be difficult to overcome as we go up these hills. And Burnside says no.
As the river continues to rise and fall unpredictably. Instead, he feinted crossings at numerous points and sent gunboats to probe known defenses to keep Lee guessing while waiting for the engineers. The first pontoons arrived on November 25th, but Burnside wouldn't cross on only one bridge. From Stafford Heights, he could clearly see Confederates on Mary's Heights across the river valley. He didn't know that he only faced Longstreet's command. So
this is another mistake by Burnside. He had chances to cross. He wouldn't let guys cross. Now he's got pontoon bridges, but he doesn't have all of them. The plan is going to be to cross at multiple points at once. But they've only got one spot they can cross in, and he's worried that they're going to get cut off and he'll lose part of his army. But he doesn't know Lee's only got part of his army, and so he waits and he waits and he waits. So as I defended him earlier, now I will criticize him. This indecision is going to be death for the Army of the Potomac in this battle.
That Lee, Jackson, and Stuart were still days away. He did know Fredericksburg was full of rebel sharpshooters, with artillery support that could just range the crossing point. He feared that forcing his entire army across a single choke point would lead to a slaughter. Thus, he waited until December 1st for all 6 bridges to arrive. By this point, Burnside's generals were all advising against continuing the campaign.
Yeah, you missed your window. The whole thing was about speed and surprise. But you've also got Lincoln back in Washington telling you attack, attack, attack. You have to go now. You have to go.
Lee's reinforced army of 72,000 were now well entrenched along the heights outside of Fredericksburg. Scouting had shown that all alternative crossing points were now well covered and fortified. Federal artillery on Stafford Heights could clear the river valley of rebels, but couldn't hit Mary's Heights. Any attack would be suicidal. However, political pressure meant Burnside had to attack. Furthermore, he knew that Lee had deployed 2 divisions east at Skinner's Neck, and believed the forces in Fredericksburg were now too thinly spread to effectively resist 120,000 soldiers.
Right. If you use 120,000 soldiers, which the Union uses nowhere near that many in this attack.
On December 9th, he issued his attack orders. After engineers built the bridges by night, Sumner's Grand Division would cross and seize Fredericksburg. Franklin would cross downstream, seize Prospect Hill, and turn the rebel flank. Sumner would then assault the disintegrating Confederate front, driving them to Richmond.
So the whole plan really, we think of Fredericksburg, and I think most people think of the attack on the stone wall at Marye's Heights. That was never meant to be the main assault. That was a feint. The plan was to turn Jackson. You have Jackson, Stonewall Jackson on the right. You have Longstreet on the left. Longstreet's holding Marye's Heights. You feint against Marye's Heights. You hold Jackson, or you hold Longstreet there, while you break Jackson's line, and then Longstreet is forced to withdraw or to send reinforcements and thin out his line. It was a good plan, considering you were attacking a difficult position. And had the Union general in command of the left flank actually committed his troops, it would have worked. Because Meade is going to break Stonewall Jackson's line, and he's going to get no help, much to his disgust.
Hooker would remain in reserve to be deployed as needed. While no general supported the plan, they reluctantly moved into position on December 10th. That night, the engineers got to work. The 3 downstream bridges were complete by 1100, but Franklin didn't actually start crossing until 1600, and wasn't finished until 1300 December 12th. Meanwhile, Confederate sharpshooters stopped construction of the upstream bridges. After a 150-gun artillery barrage destroyed but failed to clear the town, Norman Hall's brigade rode across and cleared the town in a vicious street fight while the engineers completed the bridges.
Yeah, so you have William Barksdale, a Mississippian, who has troops basically in every window and behind barricades and just picking off these Union troops that are trying to cross. And eventually what will end up happening is, because you basically have this killing zone on this pontoon bridge as guys are trying to cross and complete the bridge, you'll end up having, I think it's a Massachusetts regiment, will jump into the boats and just paddle across and try to get a beachhead on the western side of the river to allow for them to get through. By this point, most of the town has evacuated the civilians. They've evacuated up behind Confederate lines. And so the guns up here in Stafford Heights are just going to start pummeling. You're going to use whatever advantage you have, and you have artillery. So you use artillery to try and soften up the defense.
Sumner finally started crossing at 1630 as soldiers fanned out in the ruined town to root out surviving sharpshooters and loot. The Union and Confederate armies moved into position December 12th. Lee recalled all his dispatched units and deployed along the heights west of Fredericksburg behind cover, trenches, and a stone wall behind a sunken road on Marye's Heights. Burnside surveyed the battlefield, but deferred actually giving any attack orders until the next day.
Yeah, and this is a big battlefield. I mean, you're talking from north to south. In fact, I want to take a look at a map. I want to make sure I get this number right. So basically, this is the Fredericksburg battlefield, and you've got about a 5-mile stretch from the left flank of the Union attack up to the right flank of the Union attack. And at any given place on the battlefield, other than a couple of high ground spots, you really can't see everything. So this makes it difficult because you can't really exercise effective command and control, especially on the Union side, because on the Confederate side, it's basically just defend. It's everybody's in position, hold your lines. If we need to, shift things around to defend spots, fine. But the attack really comes down to these Grand Division commanders and the Corps commanders under them doing their jobs and exercising kind of an independent command.
Franklin had expected to attack at first light with his entire Grand Division. However, he didn't receive orders until 0730. For reasons unknown, rather than the bold attack described on December 9th, he was to hold his forces in position and only send one or more divisions to seize Prospect Hill and be ready to commit his whole force as necessary. The vague and weakly worded order caused Franklin to proceed cautiously.
And this is the deciding factor in this battle, is Franklin's caution. He's got tens of thousands of troops that he never commits to the fight. And you can debate whether or not that's his fault, if it's Burnside's fault for not being crystal clear in his orders, which he should have been, to remove any doubt. Don't leave any latitude for your commander to say, well, what am I supposed to do? I don't know. And so when you have, as I said earlier, Meade with his division make a breakthrough and effectively split Stonewall Jackson's line in two, you have an opportunity to exploit that, and Meade is begging for reinforcements that Franklin won't send.
Only George Meade's division to attack once the morning fog lifted, supported by John Gibbon's division.
Meanwhile, you have, I think Gibbon's actually, is Gibbon a division commander at this point? Because Gibbon, this is the battle where John Gibbon, who's from North Carolina, is going to be fighting against North Carolina troops that include, I think, 3 of his brothers that he's literally facing off against in Slaughter Pen Farm. Meanwhile, Doubleday's division over here is going to be pinned down by Pelham, and I think like at one point just one gun, literally one piece of artillery.
Stuart's horse artillery delayed Meade until the Iron Brigade drove them off at 1100. Jackson's artillery then opened up and halted Meade's advance until counter-battery fire cleared them out at 1300. Meade had only 4,500 soldiers to attack 36,000. But the terrain created a gap in Jackson's line.
Yep.
Meade found the gap and charged through it, routing 2 brigades and splitting Jackson's front line. Gibbon's attack ran into the prepared Confederate defenses, but he still managed to summit the ridgeline with heavy casualties. However, Franklin never sent reinforcements, and Meade was repelled by Jabal Early, whose counterattack was subsequently driven back by Federal artillery.
It's so frustrating to me because battle after battle in the Eastern Theater until 64, these are winnable battles for the Union if they just have competent generalship at the top. You've got these incredible generals like Gibbon and Meade and Reynolds that you see there. These are really good generals at the division and corps command level that are hampered by incompetence above them.
The upstream fight went disastrously. Sumner was also ordered to probe Mary's Heights through the open fields with 1 division, but when it was devastated by pre-sighted artillery and Longstreet's protected infantry, he ordered an all-out attack at 1300. Wave after wave of blue-clad soldiers were slaughtered valiantly charging the stone wall.
One of the most pointless losses of life during the entire war.
None came within 40 yards. Burnside ordered Hooker forward at 1530, despite him strenuously arguing against attacking to meet the same fate. Darkness ended the fighting. The Confederates suffered 5,377 casualties, almost entirely from Jackson's command. The Union lost 12,653 men in a futile attack described to Lincoln as not a battle, but butchery.
Yeah, more than double the casualties the Confederates suffered. And like he said, most of that happens on the right flank of the Confederate force. Longstreet loses hardly any men at all.
Lincoln lamented that Burnside had snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. On December 14th, Burnside asked for and received a truce to recover the wounded. Some subordinates argued to hold Fredericksburg as an operations base. Yeah,
so recover the wounded, but also recover the dead. And you have on the slopes of Marye's Heights, you have Union soldiers, guys like Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who will go on to fame at Gettysburg with the 20th Maine, laying there for like 2 days, using the bodies of their dead comrades as protection. And it was unusually warm that day, and it was December, but it was like 60 degrees on the day of the attack. During the daytime. And so a lot of these guys had kind of shed off their winter coats and things like that and the things that encumbered them. Well, then that night it gets really cold and you're laying out there with nothing.
But the town was strategically worthless while Lee held the heights. Burnside retreated across the Rappahannock the next day. The Army of the Potomac's morale was shattered and desertion rose, which Burnside's subordinates openly blamed on him.
And not only that, but a group of them will be downright subordinate by secretly going to Washington and lobbying for Burnside to be removed from command. I mean, it was dirty stuff. The politics in all of this are just nasty.
To restore morale, Burnside attempted to flank Lee by crossing the Rappahannock at US Ford on January 20th.
The Mud March.
However, heavy rain turned the roads into construction mortar, trapping the artillery. The Mud March was Burnside's last straw. He'd complained to Lincoln before about insubordinate officers, and now many were openly defiant. 2 brigadiers left their posts to go to Washington and complain directly to Lincoln. Burnside demanded the authority to dismiss his generals,
which he should have had.
Halleck recommended the complainers be court-martialed for insubordination, but he did confirm their story. Neither the soldiers nor officers had any faith in Burnside. Lincoln had to either purge the entire officer corps or Burnside. Lincoln met with Burnside on January 26th, who complained bitterly about being undermined and set up to fail before offering his resignation. Lincoln heard him out, accepted, and reassigned him west. Burnside
Interestingly, Ambrose Burnside is at Ford's Theater the night that Lincoln is assassinated, and there are some descriptions of the event that have Lincoln looking down in Burnside's direction at the moment that he was shot.
Served at his level of incompetence for 2 months.
Hooker.
After Burnside was swept out of the way, command fell to Joseph Hooker. As an old Potomac hand, he was well respected by the soldiers, and morale immediately improved. However, many generals disliked pugnacious and womanizing Fighting Joe. Those senior to him...
And the reason he's called Fighting Joe Hooker is actually from a misinterpretation of something in the newspaper. The newspaper headline said, "Fighting, Joe Hooker." It was supposed to anyway. And what it was saying was that Joe Hooker was fighting. But it got interpreted as Fighting Joe Hooker.
Resigned, enabling Hooker to disband the Grand Divisions and elevate new corps commanders. Significantly, all the cavalry was organized as a single corps.
Yeah, at this point, the cavalry has all been assigned to different units. They each have a regiment or a brigade of cavalry attached to them.
George Stoneman, and a Bureau of Military Information was established. Additionally, he launched a massive corruption investigation into the quartermaster and medical departments, improved the soldiers' living conditions and food, and rebuilt their confidence with better drills and officer training.
Yeah, this is all good stuff he does.
Burnside had shown that Lee could be deceived and would detach units to respond to feints. Hooker intended to use this for his spring campaign. Lincoln had concluded that Lee's army was the real target, and Hooker agreed. The BMI told him that Lee was closely guarding the Rappahannock, but only Stuart was watching the northern end. Thus, Hooker planned to distract Stuart, then pin and swing around Lee via Kelly's Ford.
It's ironic that Hooker's plan called for him to surprise and outflank Lee with an army that more than doubles Lee's army, and yet it's Hooker that gets surprised and outflanked at Chancellorsville.
First, the 9th Corps was deployed to Fort Monroe in early February, prompting Lee to send Longstreet with 2 divisions to contain it. Union cavalry would launch a deep penetration raid in April to cut Lee's supply lines and draw off Stuart. John Sedgwick would take the 3 corps and cross the Rappahannock south of Fredericksburg to distract Lee, while the rest of the army swung down on Lee's left across the Rapidan. Cut off and squeezed between 2 forces, Lee would either retreat towards Richmond or be intercepted and forced to fight on Hooker's terms. Key to the plan was swiftly clearing the wilderness, a dense secondary growth forest of briars, thorns, and hardwood trees. Any army marching through found communication difficult. And
yes, this is the same wilderness that will become the Battle of the Wilderness in '64. Fredericksburg, Wilderness, Chancellorsville, Spotsylvania, they're all basically in one spot.
Deployments almost impossible. Hooker planned to fight Lee on the open ground to the east, where he could effectively use his numerical advantage. Stoneman was ordered to begin the raid on April 13th, but nature intervened. Torrential rains again made the roads impassable and the Rappahannock unfordable. He tried to relaunch the raid on April 30th, only to literally bog down once over the Rappahannock.
And this is why in '64, when Grant moves toward Richmond, he's going to wait until May to do it.
The only unit to reach its target was John Buford's Reserve Brigade, composed of pre-war regulars like Buford himself, which reached out and cut the Orange and Alexandria Railway near Gordonsville May 2nd.
And later on, I believe it's Hooker that will lament that he hadn't given Buford command of the cavalry corps.
Buford's troopers destroyed supply trains, tore up railway tracks, and skirmished with Stuart's cavalry until rejoining Stoneman on May 6th. The damage Buford caused was too late to affect the main campaign, while Stoneman failed to do any meaningful damage. The raid's failure ensured that Lee and Stuart's attention was never away from Hooker. The first of Hooker's columns advanced on April 27th, and on April 30th, Hooker made headquarters in the Chancellorsville hamlet within the Wilderness. Sedgwick's force made its crossing on the 28th and advanced towards Fredericksburg.
So far, so good, right? I mean, you've got Lee right where you want him, but just like with Fredericksburg, you wait, and by waiting, you give him time to do what Lee does.
By May 1st, Hooker had 70,000 men around Chancellorsville, and Sedgwick had about 27,000 across the river and another 15,000 remaining near Falmouth. Stuart was initially cut off by Stoneman's advance, but quickly ducked the plodding raiders and discovered Hooker's movements, reporting to Lee on April 30th. Deciding that Sedgwick would only demonstrate and could be mostly ignored, Lee divided his army. Jubal Early's 11,000 men were left to hold the Fredericksburg fortifications, while Lee took the remaining 40,000 to confront Hooker.
So imagine if right at that point, Sedgwick and Reynolds attack. They outnumber them better than 2-1, almost 3-1 at this point. And that would force Lee to shift troops this way, and he's already spread thin. He's outnumbered better than 2-1. Any sort of initiative or aggression on the part of these Union forces could have turned this into a debacle for the Confederacy.
Longstreet and half his divisions were too far south to join the battle. Lee's closest division to Hooker was dug in between the Zone and Tabernacle churches. Jackson arrived at 1100 May 1st and ordered them to join him advancing on Hooker. At the same time, Hooker began advancing out of the Wilderness. The two forces ran into each other at the forest edge around 1120. A confused fight ensued, with many gaps in both lines. As the Union forces straightened their line, Meade's 5th Corps advanced down River Road, threatening Jackson's flank. However, Hooker halted the advance and pulled back. He'd always planned to fight defensively rather than risk another Fredericksburg, and his advanced columns were outnumbered. Jackson and Lee would make him pay for that decision.
You can't fight defensively. You're attacking because you're in enemy territory. You're trying to push toward their capital. You outnumber them 2-1. You have to be aggressive. So frustrating.
That night, Stuart reported that while the Union left was solidly anchored on the river, the right was floating unsupported along the Orange Turnpike.
Yep.
Better, a recently constructed road provided a route around the flank, hidden from Union sight. Lee and Jackson couldn't resist such an opportunity. Meanwhile, Hooker realized that Sedgwick's demonstrations hadn't worked, and recalled the 1st Corps from Fredericksburg to bolster his left flank.
So this planned attack, and I did a video there too, it was one of my early ones that I did, it was on that same trip, I think. It was on that same trip. It's like 11 miles. It basically what you have is you have the lead parts of Jackson's column arriving at the attack location at about the time that the end of the column is first starting to march. So you've got a good, 6, 7, 8 hours in there where Howard could have taken advantage and destroyed Jackson's force as it was still getting into position. He had been warned. You're going to have a moment where Dan Sickles, right here in the middle, is going to see the Confederate forces marching, and he's going to send word of what's happening, and Hooker's going to conclude that it's Lee's army retreating from his superior force. It could not have been more wrong, and they're going to miss an opportunity.
However, the telegram didn't arrive until after dawn, and the Corps didn't arrive in time. Jackson began secretly moving 28,000 men at dawn, leaving Lee with 13,000 men to pin Hooker. Union pickets and observation balloons noted rebel movement, but couldn't determine what kind. Hooker decided that it could be a flanking maneuver and warned the 11th Corps.
He did, but he also was pretty sure that that's not what it was. But yeah, Howard was warned. He had plenty of time to pull that right side back and keep it from being out in the air. These are troops. Howard's 11th Corps is mostly German immigrant soldiers who had been under command of a German, but now were under Oliver Howard, who is this very devout Christian man who had lost an arm and been given the Medal of Honor for action in 1862, and was not liked or trusted by his men, and it just turns into a disaster.
Falsely assured that they were prepared, he ordered Sedgwick to attack, and Sickles' 3rd Corps forward to probe Lee's line. Sickles found and captured Jackson's rearguard,
Yep.
but missed the column. Which
Yeah, there was this Georgia regiment who basically has to stay behind and hold the line while the rest of Jackson's column gets away, and many of them get captured or killed. But again, where's the rest of them? Where did they go? Oh, they retreated. It's no big deal.
Past the 11th Corps line, fully flanking it. Individual Union units realized that something was wrong, but no alert was raised. At 17:30, Jackson's attack began. Most of the Union Army was preparing dinner when the rebel yell rang out. A few regiments had taken the warning seriously and attempted to resist, but were rolled over as the 11th Corps disintegrated. Seeing soldiers routing past his headquarters, Hooker sprang onto his horse and attempted to rally the panicked soldiers, while ordering his old division forward to halt the advance.
So, fun fact, one of the generals under Jackson's command here is actually in command of the old Stonewall Brigade. His name's Elisha Paxton, and Elisha Paxton is the great-great-grandfather of actor Bill Paxton.
Artillery was moved to Fairview Cemetery to form a new line. The Confederates advanced over a mile, before being halted by darkness and the wilderness causing disorganization. During the night, Sickles pulled back to Hazel Grove, hoping to continue the attack under the full moon.
Yeah, Sickles wanted to actually launch a night attack. You don't have night attacks happening much at this point in history, but the full moon is a good opportunity to do that. You can at least see something, and this is Sickles, who's a political war Democrat, political general, one of the few political generals who rises to the level of Corps command and performs relatively competently to this point. I say to this point because Gettysburg is coming. But he wanted to be aggressive at a time when he had a commanding general who was not interested in being aggressive.
Jackson rode out to reconnoiter the Federal line. Disastrously, he failed to return the way he'd left and was fired upon by soldiers expecting Union cavalry, not their beloved general, hitting Jackson 3 times. A.P. Hill was wounded by artillery fire while evacuating Jackson. Jackson's arm had to be amputated and pneumonia set in.
Yeah, so Jackson's arm is actually amputated and buried on what is today the Wilderness Battlefield, just a couple of miles west of here. And you can actually visit the site where it's supposedly buried. He's taken to Guinea Station and he dies about a week later.
Stonewall Jackson died May 10th. Stuart took over Jackson's command, but was separated from Lee by Sickles' position in Hazel Grove and vulnerable to counterattack. Lee didn't know how to drive Sickles from the formidable position and reunite his army until Hooker helped him by ordering Sickles to tighten the line and withdraw to the Plank Road. Stuart seized this critical high ground and made it his chief artillery position. From here, he successfully drove Hooker from Chancellorsville into a horseshoe around U.S. Ford by noon.
And at this point, this is still a very winnable battle. The Union still has a huge numerical advantage. The surprise attack has lost a lot of its steam. The Union is in a strong defensive position. And there are plenty of reasons for them to still feel optimistic about attacking. But in the midst of all this, Hooker is coming out of his headquarters and an artillery shell slams into it and rings his bell. He probably has a concussion. And from that point, he's just a shell of a man.
Hooker was concussed by shrapnel and failed to effectively lead the army thereafter. Lee intended
He absolutely should have stepped down, let somebody else take over. This could have turned out differently.
Shove Hooker with a combined mass assault, but learned that Sedgwick was attacking and had successfully stormed Mary's Heights. After 2 failed probes, his men flanked the stone wall and devastated the defenders, getting some revenge for 1st Fredericksburg. With Sedgwick now advancing on his rear, Lee again divided his army and moved to defeat Sedgwick, believing...
So there are some famous photographs that you often see of Confederate dead in the on the sunken road that's right behind that stone wall in Marie's Heights, and a lot of people think it's from Fredericksburg, but the famous photograph's actually taken after this fight at Fredericksburg.
Hooker defeated. Hooker was largely incapacitated that night and into the 4th, but he refused to cede command or give any orders.
Ridiculous. I've said it till I'm blue in the face. This is such a wasted opportunity if you just had the right people at high levels of command.
Lee led 20,000 soldiers to link up with Early and successfully attacked Sedgwick near Salem Church. Sedgwick retreated back to Falmouth on May 5th, having requested but received neither reinforcements nor orders from Hooker. Meanwhile, Hooker's War Council advocated staying and fighting,
Yeah.
but a delirious Hooker overruled them.
He asks their opinion, and they're like, we've got this. We can win this battle. Let us fight it. No, we're gone.
And ordered a retreat, which was successfully completed May 6th. Stoneman rejoined the army the next day.
This is why it's such a big deal when you get to 64 and you bring Grant to the east, and they have the fight here in this same spot at the Wilderness, just a little bit to the west of here. And when Grant pulls his forces back and they start marching south instead of north to retreat, everybody knows something has changed because they've been in this situation before.
In one sense, Chancellorsville was Lee's perfect battle. He'd repeatedly divided his army in the face of superior numbers and overcome his primary foe through audacity, exceptional scouting, and superior morale. He'd then defeated the secondary one through superior numbers, knowledge of the terrain, and tactical supremacy. Everything that made Robert E. Lee was on full display in glorious victory, and Lee now believed his army was invincible. However, Longstreet considered Chancellorsville a disaster and heavily criticized Lee's strategy once he rejoined the army. Losing Jackson was equivalent to losing half the army. Even had he survived, the casualties were unacceptable. Hooker had suffered.
And this is the thing. When you go on the offensive as the defending force, you're sacrificing men that you can't replace. And this is why I often say that Robert E. Lee is a brilliant tactical general. He's great on a battlefield, but strategic thinking is not his forte. Strategically, he could not afford to do things like Antietam and Gettysburg. He couldn't launch those kinds of invasions of the North and gain anything that would have turned the tide of the war. He needed to sit back, batter the Union by the Union throwing troops at them like they do at Fredericksburg and at Spotsylvania, and bloody the Union until they give up, until the morale of the northern populace turns against it. They don't want to spend any more money, spend any more blood to make this happen.
About 17,200 casualties, including 4,000 captured. Lee had lost about 13,300 casualties, including 2,000 missing or captured. Discounting the captured and missing, casualties were effectively the same, but Hooker could replace his losses, and Lee couldn't.
Yep.
Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville were impressive but empty victories at best.
They're tactical victories, but they don't gain you anything in the big picture, really.
Nothing had changed from 1861, except the army's raggedness, and its victories were bleeding it dry.
Yep.
Lee must have felt some truth in Longstreet's assessment, and he began planning another offensive to either win the war or doom the South. To see how that plan plays out, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button.
So I'll say this. I really like the analytical aspect of what Kings and Generals present here. The interpretation of events and kind of the analyzing of Lee's strengths and weaknesses and the impact of these battles, I think is spot on. So I think they did a really good job. Whoever did their research and wrote that all did a great job with that. So as I said before, I'll put links down in the description to my visits to the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville battlefields. Those are early VTH stuff. So the quality is not what it is today with some of my newer original content, but I think it's still effective and it gives you an opportunity to see some of the places we just talked about. So check those out. Thanks for watching.